really like to thank you all for joining us at this second session of the Planning and Place Forum. I'm really pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Nick Wright. So Nick is a chartered town planner, a fellow of the Royal Town Planning Institute. And after 15 years working in Scottish local authorities on community housing projects in Indonesia, he set up his own practice, Nick Wright Planning, back in 2004. Nick is passionate about shaping places for the future, and he does that by bringing together people to turn great ideas into action. So please join me in welcoming Nick to today's session. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Nick. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks very much, Sarah. Very kind of you. And thanks for inviting me along today. It's very good to have the chance to have a chat through and to hear your views as well after a few minutes about local place plans. So I've got some thoughts, some slides, and a couple of examples to run through, really to try and share the diversity of local place plans that are emerging everywhere. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for some chat, questions, reflections, whatever it might be, afterwards in the second half. So should be a tale of two halves, I hope. So I'll just try and share my slides, which hopefully will all appear. So welcome to those who've just joined as well. Very good to see everyone. Hi there. So I'll just run through about 20-25 minutes of slides, and then we'll have the remaining time as much as we need for reflections and questions. So I thought I'd start off just with a reminder, as much for myself as everybody else, about what local place plans are and what the government said in the 2019 Act, and then the regulations that really kicked local place plans to start off from early 2022. Local place plans are community-led plans setting out proposals for the development and use of land, and they are to be taken into account in the preparation of local development plans. And that's different from, if any of you have worked down south, neighbourhood plans are different in that they become statutory planning policy, and they have a more rigid regime, if you like, of regulation around how they need to have a vote around them and then be approved and go to inspectors and that kind of thing. It's a much more flexible approach the Scottish Government have taken. There's far less regulation around how you prepare a local place plan. But I guess the flip side of that is that they only have to be taken into account in the preparation of planning policy rather than they become planning policy itself. So that's what the government says. And since they came into force, or since communities could produce them in January 2022, there's been lots and lots of plans produced. I don't know how many. Planning Aid Scotland is just starting on research, which is great, to find out how many there have been and do some analysis of them. And the government will be doing some research on that next year, but I'll come back to that in a moment. I guess the big thing about local place plans is that they're community-led. So that's very different from any other plans that came before in the planning system in Scotland, which, you know, of course, for decades, all statutory planning policy has had to have consultation with local communities, but that's very different from community-led. And of course, the difference is that a local place plan is based around what a local community wants for its area. It's their aspirations. It has to take account of planning policy, but it doesn't necessarily have to comply with it. So I'll come back to a couple of examples of local place plans in a second to try to illustrate that. But before I do that, how I kind of observe local place plans developing in practice in the last three and a half years is that they've increasingly been not just about planning, statutory land use planning, but about placemaking in a wider sense as well, which isn't specifically covered in the legislation, but neither is it prohibited by the legislation. So I guess this is people, including some of you on the call, pushing the envelope of what local place plans could do, because there's no reason not to, I guess. So they're about place, not just planning. I think they're a really good way of delivering national agendas at a local level, and I'll come back to that. They're also a good way of building consensus at a local level, which is, so you might get within any one community, any one village, any one neighborhood, town, you might get lots of different views around what the priorities for that place should be. A local place plan can be a way of building a bit of consensus around what the community's priorities should be, and that is useful because it helps funders, for example, who might want to fund projects, understand consensus. It helps the local authority in developing its local development plan, see what the priorities are that they should focus on for the community. So having some consensus that's recorded in a document is a really useful thing. They can support community action, communities to do things themselves, of which there's a long track record through, not necessarily through town planning, but through the community development sector, doing things like community action plans, which have been around for many years, to support what communities want to do themselves. It could be initiatives, projects, whatever they might want to do. It could be anything from for example, a community transport scheme, to building their own houses, to something that's not related to planning or land at all. So plans can usefully support that, and that's linked to the building consensus thing as well. And then the final one I've put down is guiding public services and policy, because really plans are a statement of aspiration by community, but they can also have a lot of useful background information from consultation and engagement. So it's a bit of a kind of gold mine, if you like, if you're trying to develop public policy at the local authority level, maybe, and decide how to change public services. I'll try and illustrate each of these points as we go through the two examples in a moment. But you might also have other things that you think local place plans are good for in practice. That's only my take on it. So I'd be very interested to hear those when we get to the discussion a bit later on. So that's local place plans in practice from my perspective. And just before we get on to the examples, then next year, I was in a meeting with Paul, who's on the call, a few weeks ago, and we discovered from the civil servants that the planning legislation has a 7-year review of local place plans built into it, which I assumed wouldn't happen for a while yet. But in fact, we were told that it's 7 years from the 2019 Act. So that review will be taking place next year. So I thought it might be interesting just to start to think about what themes might be included in that 7-year review. So I've just noted half a dozen down there. So what's the national coverage? How many are there? Where are they? Well, we should find a lot of that out from the Planning Aid Scotland research that I mentioned, but it'll be really good to get a picture, whether it's from Planning Aid or from the government next year, a picture of that, because none of us know, unless anyone on the call has done it themselves, none of us know exactly where all these local place plans are, because they're coming thick and fast. I did try to keep a tab on them till about a year ago, but I've lost track now because there are so many. So what's the national coverage is one theme that might be in the review next year. Another theme might be, how are they procured? So who prepares them? Is it just community councils, other community trusts, for example, other community organizations? How much do they get stimulated, chivied along, perhaps by local authorities, planning authorities to do it? How much do they cost? Who pays for them? So there's a bunch of questions there. We know that quite often, well, I don't know the cost. I think it can vary from a few £100, and I've seen one that cost over £50,000, which I think that's an outlier. I suspect a few £100 at the other end is an outlier as well. That would be completely done by volunteers. I suspect if consultants are involved, it's going to be at least a few £1,000s, but who knows, because these costs are generally not bandied around too much. Who pays? Well, there is no national fund for preparing local place plans. It was suggested in government funded research before the 2019 Act that there should be a national fund, not least because it would avoid the problem. It would maximize targeting of funding to support areas which, for example, have worse inequalities. So there would be a purpose in the government providing some coordinated funding. Now that hasn't happened, and the funding that's available is generally either from local authorities, where they manage to scrape together some money from a budget, which could be from planning, or it could be from regeneration, or quite often community benefit funding from renewable energy sector. Quite often they support producing local place plans if a community is near a wind farm or a hydro scheme, for example, because they're keen, because the renewables firms are keen to see the community benefit funding spent on things which there is consensus for within the community. So back to that consensus point earlier on. So some funding from local authorities, some funding from renewables. There may be other sources as well. But significantly, there's no national funding to coordinate, I guess, the greatest impact of local place plans. How are they prepared? Well, lots of different ways. There are lots of different styles, if you like, and approaches of doing local place plans. And we could chat for ages about this, but I guess they can be very varied in that they can be very local. I've been involved in one which was just about parks and green spaces in Balmulloch and Rob Royston in northeast Glasgow. So quite a couple of neighbourhoods, very specialised, just about their green spaces, quite detailed, right up to whole kind of area local place plans around, for example, the whole of the Black Isle or the whole of the Garnock Valley in North Ayrshire, covering 3 towns, which I'll come back to as one of my 2 examples in a minute. They can be very short, very quick, relatively quick to do. So there's a few in Midlothian, for example, on the Midlothian Council local place plan register that's online. Some of those are a few pages of a Word document. Very easy for a community to do, compared to, for example, the 50,000 plus one that I mentioned earlier on, which is Wester Hales in Edinburgh, which had a team of designers and consultants involved in supporting the community. So you can get a massive variety, some volunteer-led, some consultant-led, some in the middle, but obviously they all need to be community-led in that their aspirations are the thing that's in the plan. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's not necessarily the case that consultant plans are better, because the whole point is that it's the community voice that shines through in the plan. And I remember working on an early one in Stratherick and Foyers to the east of Loch Ness, which followed on from a community action plan. And I remember challenging the community trust there about, do you really need consultants to do this plan, or would it be better to do it yourselves? And in forcing that question, they decided that they did need consultants, but it made them think about why. And the reason they came up with was, we think it's important to have somebody impartial to come along and to help run the events, and maybe to negotiate where there are differences of opinion within the community. And I thought it was good that they worked out why they need the consultant. And in fact, another one I've been involved in more recently, which is in Morningside, Edinburgh, the community are doing 90% of the work because they can and they want to, and they're just using consultants for a very small bit of the work about running some community engagement events and producing an independent report of those events. But they will produce the plan on the back of that. And so I think it's really good and very interesting to see different ways emerging of working with consultants, rather than the traditional conventional way of you give the consultant the job to produce the plan, which is of course how things almost always worked before local place plans came along. So that's the how are they prepared. There's a lot of different experience there. Impact on planning policy, well, it's really far too soon to say, and I think it will still be too soon to say next year as well, because most local development plans prepared by local authorities won't be ready until probably 2028. So we won't really know the impact. We won't really know how local authorities are taking account of local place plans in their LDPs really until towards the end of that process to 2028. And a part of that will be how seriously reporters take, trying to avoid say cognizance because it's a terrible word, how much importance reporters put on local place plans when they're weighing up draft local development plans at examinations. I think it's worth saying though that my hunch is that local authorities I've spoken to and national park authorities, I think there's an emerging sense that they need to take them pretty seriously, and that most of them want to take local place plans pretty seriously as well. So Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, for example, they've for years, a couple of decades, they've used the forerunners of local place plans, community action plans. They've used those as sources of information to inform their planning policy over successive local development plans. So they're already well used to it, and they find that very useful source of local intelligence. And speaking to Glasgow City Council a few months ago, one of the planners in the planning policy team there basically explained that to a public meeting effectively, that there's actually quite a bit of pressure on local authorities to make sure that they take quite serious account of local place plans, because if they don't, then the reporters in the government will give them a hard time when the local development plans are being examined and checked. So the signs are hopeful, but we're not going to know for a couple of years at least how that's getting on. An ultimate bullet point, I've written other uses, which is quite interesting. So local place plans potentially have lots of other uses beyond planning policy, and it'd be really interesting for the review next year to kind of get under the skin of that. So, for example, I've seen them be used as an evidence base. So the Black Isle plan, which was funded by the local authority, Highland Council, it was registered by the council, as you would expect for a local place plan, but they also separately agreed, so using their words, to adopt the plan and use it as a tool to inform and support decision making about the Black Isle. Now, that was because the plan has lots of other things in beyond land use planning around public transport, healthcare, education, green Freeport, all this kind of thing. So the council there realised it was a useful source of information about community aspirations that could inform their public service delivery. So there's a useful extra function of a local place plan. I've already mentioned about supporting community action on the previous slide, and there's lots of examples in the last couple of years about citing a community project in a local place plan can help it get funding and get consents. So Stratherick and Foyers by Loch Ness that I mentioned earlier, their plan was registered 2 years ago, and it helped get funding and consent for community-led housing, which is now being built. So there are direct connections there. And in fact, Paul and I were in a meeting with civil servants a few weeks ago about the current, how reforming Section 75, what's known as planning gain, and how that might be produced. And there was discussion there about, well, why couldn't the evidence of community aspirations in local place plans be tapped into as a source of evidence about community aspirations for local authorities when they're deciding where planning gain money should be spent from larger planning consents, schools or transport or whatever. It could be an extra factor to help that spending be influenced by community thoughts and aspirations. So there's a few potential other uses, and there'll be more as well. I suspect you've probably got good ideas yourselves. And then finally, I mentioned about the impact on delivering national agendas. So I said earlier on about delivering national agendas locally. I'll give an example of that in a moment, but I think it's important to remember that I think there's a strong connection, particularly with the whole community empowerment, community wealth building agenda. And I'll come back to that in the Garnock Valley example that I'll run through in a few minutes. So I'm going to just move on to the two examples that I've got, and I'll be quite quick on these because time is flying away with me much more than I thought. So the first one is Kinlochleven. There's a website for it, which kinlochlevenfutures.net. I'm just going to show a few selected pages from the plan here. You can go away and have a look at it if you're interested. But really the point is just to pick out a few salient points, not tell you the entire plan. The community decided that they would get their forward written by their local MSP, who happens to be the Deputy First Minister. Thought that was a really good idea. She was very keen to do it, Kate Forbes, and of course that just helps what could be quite a small, easily forgotten village plan have much more traction amongst the public sector in particular. The plan covered the community council area for Kinlochleven, just between Fort Liam and Glencoe. The community council area is massive, so it covers a huge hinterland. It's probably about 20 miles from east to west and about 5 or 10 miles north to south. But interestingly, because it's a community-led plan, and the only place really where people live in that big area is the village of Kinlochleven itself, with a couple of houses to the west as well. No one lives in the big area to the east at all. So because it's a community-led plan, there's really nothing in the plan about 90% of the area. It's all focused on the community, which I think was a surprise to some planners in the council at first. They were expecting maybe a bit more about the rural area, the future of the mountains, climate change, moorlands, all that kind of thing. But the community's focus is about where they live. So that's what the plan focuses on. And in fact, when you look at the, I can scoot forward, all the proposals are all on one map. And as you can probably see from that, that map is really tight around the village itself. That's just a fraction of the community council area. So it's interesting when you ask a community about its aspirations. My experience of rural ones is that inevitably they focus almost exclusively on the places that they live rather than the wider hinterland. Anyway, so that particular plan, we ended up divvying it up, if you like, into 4 big transformational projects, like the big derelict site of the old aluminium smelter that shut 20-30 years ago, which still is derelict and needing to make better use of that, fixing the town centre, plus a couple of other things. Then the middle column on the map is about 10 spatial projects. And then the right-hand column of about 20 things is non-spatial projects that we couldn't locate on a particular location. And to give you a flavour of what those things are, that's the full list. There's a page about the old smelter site, key partners, first steps, and in fact actions progressing on that now. So the landowner is now finally coming to the table to discuss it. And there's even talk of a community buyout of that, which wasn't on the cards before the local place plan. So that's really positive. And then some of the smaller actions are things like managing deer in the village, because they cause no end of hassle coming in, chomping all the stuff in the community garden and leaving their droppings in the play areas and that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of smaller actions around that, which are all very important, but most of them are quite hard to locate spatially. So that's just a flavour of that plan. And then the other one is very different. So the other example, this is the Garnock Valley in North Ayrshire, is a council ward covering 3 towns, Kilbirnie, Beath and Dalry, so between Paisley and Irvine. Has a history of mining and steel, which disappeared in the 70s, perhaps the 80s at its final throes. So it's got a lot of kind of post-industrial concerns. And this all came about because the community councils and the community trusts, essentially the organised community groups in the areas, came together with local authority funding to produce a plan for their joint area, which is a recognised community of identity locally. So people do relate to the Garnock Valley. It's not a kind of imposed structure. And it took 2 years to do because it was so big and so complicated. You can see the location of where it is on the map there. You can see the red outline of it. About 20,000 people live there. So because it covers multiple communities, then it was more complicated to do. There's the process, pretty standard, of starting out by thinking of aspirations and then homing in on priorities and then a draft plan, obviously with community engagement through this all the way. I can come back to any of these if you need me to later on. The community survey that was done fairly early on in the process was really, really useful. It got about 750 responses from memory. Just check. Yeah, about 750 responses, which is a fraction of the population, but it's a big enough number for common themes to emerge. And just asking people fairly simple questions, like to score existing community issues which are well known, that's that list on the screen there, to score them, and then you start to see which ones are most important to people, and then to ask open questions about the condition of what they like and don't like about their place, for example, and what their ideas are for the future. You probably find it difficult to read those, although they're all on the website. But you get really, really rich data about, on the left is the Garnock Valley as a whole. So you can, just in counting up how many people mention what idea that they've thought of, you start to see patterns emerging about public transport's absolutely vital. We need more events and activities, for example. Or on the right-hand side, for each town, when you break down the results town by town, improve the town centre, better public transport, fix dilapidated buildings. These things all emerge as absolutely top priorities. So that's invaluable information on which to prepare the plan. And really, you've got the plan almost there. You just have to flesh out the actions that go underneath that. And in fact, that's what then happened. The process, there were 8 big calls to action were agreed. So this is focus, rather than trying to do everything, focusing in on priorities. These were agreed through a kind of sequence of community engagement activities over a year or so. They made it into the plan, and then each of those has 2 or 3 pages in the plan to explain why it's important, what we're trying to achieve, what needs to happen, and then a few actions against each one, with examples from elsewhere, which people liked because they said, oh, it shows we can do it. So if it was done in Galashiels, we can do it here, or if it was done in Kilmarnock, we can do it here. So that's how the plan was written up. And then each town has its own sort of spatial map of priorities as well, which links more directly into the next local development plan. And this last week, this, much to everyone's surprise, because the plan was only registered about 2 weeks ago, it got a special award from Scotland Loves Local with the minister last week, which was brilliant for the 2 ladies there, Helen and Sheena, are from 2 of the community groups. It was their idea to put the submission for the award in. I was a bit skeptical, but it got the award, and their idea all the way forward was, if we get this award, it gives us more clout, and we can use this to get more funding and more support from the public sector. And it's already proved invaluable, even in the last fortnight, to support bids to the UK government for the Pride in Places money that's being dispersed at the moment. Having the award is immensely supportive for that, and the council has been really helpful on that too. Anyway, I'm straying into delivery stuff, which is another whole subject entirely. But I hope those 2 examples gave you a bit of fleshed out to illustrate some of those points I was mentioning in the first part of the presentation. So I can go back to any of those slides. I'm interested in your questions, which might not be to me, they could be to each other as well, and any thoughts you have. And if anyone's I'm particularly interested in how much do you think local place plans put communities in charge, which was the title of the presentation. Do you think that will happen or not? So I will stop sharing at this point, and shall I quickly hand back to you, Sarah?
Yeah, sure.
And we can take it from there.
If anybody has got any questions, please can you raise your hand and we will take them in order. And I'll just give people a moment.
And it could be reflections as well.
Or yeah, indeed, any reflections that they'd like to share or observations on the session.
And feel free to drop into chat as well.
So, Hale. Yeah, many thanks, Nick. It's a very interesting presentation, and I was not aware that about the clarity about the local place plans role. So my question is, and you also raised in some of the impact, and I can see there is impact, but the overall local place plans has no legal backup, that kind of things. So in that way, how much it impacts on the regulatory frameworks, and of course it's feed up to the regulatory framework, but how do you envisage some of the impact in the indirect way?
Well, it's a good question, Sale, and I'm not sure the answer. And I'd be quite interested in the views of some of the other folk on the call who work on local place plans as well. I think we'll get an answer on impact from the government review next year, because my trouble is, because I work at the local level on a series of local place plans, I find it quite difficult to stand back from that and see the strategic impact across the country. Really, all I'm doing is just kind of building up from, oh, I see an impact in the Black Isle that was good, or an impact in Loch Ayrshire, or over in Morningside. So I find it quite difficult to stand back and see the impact. And I guess from my perspective, what I see so far, I see the biggest impacts are probably around, from ones I've been involved with, about giving confidence to people that their ideas are good and they can do things at a community level. That's not so much about planning, and real impacts about plans being used by communities and local authorities to wave around and support funding bids in order to get projects happening. But that's only my view, and I think that there's quite likely to be other experience around the room of positive impacts as well that might be different.
Thanks.
And in fact, Paul has his hand up and may well have experience of other positive impacts too. Paul, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, sure. Nick, so not disappointed, always come along and learn stuff, so thank you so much. I think just to check, it's basically just answering a couple of your questions during the presentation. So I think that other good things that LPPs are good for, I think that they can be really good for connecting in with the land reform agenda. So enabling communities in rural areas and urban areas, I guess, to link into community right to buy legislation, and thinking about both in terms of like very vacant and derelict land, what options they actually have, identifying those, and then what options might they have to shift the dial on how those pieces of land are actually benefiting or not benefiting the community. I think that, and also just having an opportunity collaboratively to think about whether they want to push forward with identifying lands or finding out that they've got a commonty in the area that they didn't know about. Those aren't really specifically planning issues. You wouldn't really necessarily have to say anything planning policy-wise about that, but I think they can be really good on those things. I also think I think there's a huge piece that we're missing around the potential for local action around climate adaptation and education of communities, and helping them understand the opportunities and solutions for effects and impacts that they're already seeing, and enabling that from the ground up. Again, there are different ways you could influence plans like that, but I think local place plans could be and are potentially really important in that regard. And at least I always try and make that quite a key issue that we encourage communities to talk about because it's so impactful. And then in terms of the review, I really agree with you that we'll probably need a second review, because next year we're not going to be able to find out much about how they've actually impacted assessment, which is Sahel's question. So if LPPs don't become statutory documents as they can in England, then how will they actually be treated in practice, both in development management decisions for site-specific applications? We can actually research that right now, I think. So they should already have an impact, so we can research that in the first review, but particularly in what policies actually come forward into local development plans, we'll have to wait a bit longer. Very, very briefly, so stuff that could happen in the first review, I think we need to look at socioeconomic spread of where they're coming forward. So this is a really long-standing question that people have had. On this one, I think that essentially we're looking at, because there's no funding from the government, I think we're looking at a situation of basically market failure. So for no fault of their own, communities that have less money are less likely to be able to bring forward a local place plan. And I think that therefore, ultimately, it's going to have to be government agencies that prioritise these communities. I think that there's a range of public sector arm's length organisations that receive significant government money in a context where we say there's no money to help poor communities, but actually we're just not allocating those resources within those organisations well enough to actually go, yeah, actually we've got some money and we'll actually have someone employed to actually do the work on behalf of the bottom 10% of the SIMD communities. So I think that's a really critical one. I'll stop there. That's probably too much.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Paul. Completely agree. Yeah. Lucy. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So I was going to introduce Lucy. Sorry, Lucy. Please feel free to ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm an architect. I wanted to share, I guess, a couple of observations as well, or things that I've seen in practice. I do have a sense that, there is a genuine shift in the industry towards community voices underpinning where funds go. And certainly things like sometimes national lottery funding applications or, community projects, they do need to kind of show that evidence base. And so I have definitely seen the community action plans and local place plans kind of offering that evidence base. I've had the same concern Paul just raised for a long time, which is the kind of equity in terms of access to that. I do think that it is the communities that have the capacity in the first place to actually create some form of action, to even have a community council, to pull together that even that volunteering time is a privilege. And then the next step again is that access to actually fund that in some way. And even when you say, oh, you can do it on a budget, it then means you need more of that community time. And actually, the more deprived communities are, they have less access to both those things. So I totally agree, there needs to be, in order for that to be an equitable vehicle, there needs to be access to support, whether that's to support that community time so that it can be really targeted and used for the kind of decision making and really supported, and also on the funding side to get consultant help if that's what the community wishes to do. Yeah, I thought I had another point, but I've just lost it.
Well, do come back to it if we need to, Lucy. So just say if it comes back. But I think that point's really, really important. You just said, and it's well, I think there's something really important around delivery of these as well, because of course, if a developer does a plan or a master plan, then they do it basically because they have resources then generally to go on and make it happen. But of course, when a community organization does a plan like this, then the chances are it doesn't have the resources, and it's really it's more of a manifesto of what they want to happen. So you just hinted at it there. There's such an important thing about making sure that we don't do what we did with charrettes a few years ago, where I remember a local authority officer saying to me, we just get charrette reports piling up on the table and we can't do anything with them because there's no money. And we need to avoid falling into that same trap again. So it's money for preparing plans, as you both just said, and then money for delivering what's in those plans too.
Yeah, which actually leads to the point that I dropped, which is that I have seen the local place plans being used as a vehicle to kind of set up those community projects, you know, and define what they are, what might they be, and really influence the direction. And then that then being a vehicle to then look for specific funding. So I did take part in the calendar charrette very early in my career, and have recently had discussions on how, you know, it was all like a great source of information, but it had no next steps, no sort of action points, and no real support then also, you know, the follow-up support for the communities. And I think that's also my concern with the local place plans. It's how do they all translate into the next steps? And so one of them is obviously them, you know, becoming part of policy, but there are other support networks and other funding that is required to then make the things happen, so it doesn't become just another charrette report that sits on the table, as you said. Yeah,
I think one of the reasons that the Garnock Valley one, for me, is so interesting is that although it is community-led, it's their aspirations. The local authority has been in the background all the way along, not to influence the plan, but to enable the plan to be produced. And they're now continuing to, so they're funding at least a year's worth of development support, a year's worth of delivery support to give the working group who produced the plan of community organisations, to give them continued support for at least another year afterwards. And hopefully they'll carry on with that support after that year. Because of course the idea is that the plan becomes not just the community's plan, but it becomes the public sector's plan as well, for them to help deliver. I mean, whether this will happen or not, who knows? But that's what we're trying to make happen, for all the reasons you've just said, Lucy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nick, there's been a really interesting point there come from Jonathan, actually, who's asking that if there's a risk that local place plans can actually encourage aspiration, but not being built with very limited due diligence, so essentially raising aspirations without actually coming through with any kind of delivery. Are we risking disappointment?
That's a good question, Jonathan. Feel free to chip in a bit more. Your hand's up.
Yeah, so just on that, the sort of second part is the risk is that it's not difficult to raise aspiration in a place. Anybody who cares, who's got a kind of leading personality can encourage aspiration, and that's an important thing to be able to do. But the difference between local place plans and other plans in an area that are developer led is an awful lot to do with the evidence base. So that's what I mean by due diligence. What technical evidence are they're being built of? Because that's what wins debate and influence in the kind of planning meetings that I'm certainly involved in. That has to be the objective position that's taken, as well as the process that the plan has been built around.
Lucy, did you have a thought in response to that?
Yes, and also a sort of follow-up that it's not just the follow-on, but also actually the breadth. And I do think, especially in terms of the two plans you were showing, Nick, one which was very, very much focused on the community only, and whilst those are the immediate community priorities, it does miss the opportunities of the kind of broader, wider look, and perhaps the sustainability, climate, the opportunities there could be for community wealth building, or so many other. And I do wonder whether there is then also a disparity between plans that might be purely community-led and plans that might be consultant-led, and then the different aspirations and specialisms of those, consultant teams in terms of how narrow or how broad the vision is. And I wonder if it would actually be really helpful if there was a sort of basic, almost like a structure which people could use as guidance to say, have you considered this? And it may or may not be relevant, but have you considered it because it could be beneficial?
Yeah.
And then
This is-
it kind of follows on to what Jonathan said about, then leading on then the next steps.
This is all making me think. I don't know if I can voice this, but there's a really interesting thing about, there's almost two models in my head of a community-led plan. So one is that essentially, because communities have not been able to express or articulate their voice in their own plan before, because they've not had that chance to do it, now there's a chance to do it. There's something really powerful about the kind of Kinloch-Leven style version, if you like, to be simplistic about it, which is, here's what we want for our community. And it's a statement of aspiration, and it's a statement of, that comes from our lived experience. And that's really important. And then there's a sort of more holistic plan, which is rooted, which is a combination of the community aspirations, but also what the public sector want to do, and might be based more realistically, if you like, on available resources, and include all the technical evidence base that you were describing, Jonathan. And in a way, there's room for both of those. And I guess this is where my thoughts are a bit ill-formed. I guess I wonder, if we go to the fully evidence-led plan, is there a danger that it loses the community-led bit because that gets subsumed into a part of a bigger thing? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I guess that's the risk in my mind, and I'd be interested what you all think about that, because I could be completely wrong. It could be so it might not be a risk. It could just be in my head. Paul, is that what you were thinking? I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, but I don't want to. It's important that other people get to share if they. I have thoughts, but okay, I'll maybe give it back.
Yeah.
So I think structurally, I think I want to go back to the 1970s when we reformed borough councils into larger local authority areas, because at heart, I think the questions here are partly about questions of scale. So I'm moving slightly away from the expertise thing and more into the democracy thing. So we lost locally rooted borough councils in the 70s, which were representative bodies at a lower scale than the vast regional authorities that we now have. And so regional authorities have these huge areas that they have to oversee and implement placemaking plans for. And it's very difficult to get to the granularity of insight and vision at a local level for them. Similarly, at a local level, it's harder to see the strategic integration. And part of the issue is that it ends up being a dialogue between a slightly more parochial local view that has significant detail and insights, and the strategic necessities of resource allocation. So one group sees itself as having participatory democracy, and the other is representative democracy. And what we've lost in the middle is a lower scale context of representative democracy, which would allow a more local vision to have a connection to power and decision making at a more granular scale. And so by removing that and replacing them with community councils, we've now realised that we need to fill the power gap with development trusts who are emerging to try and do this stuff. And then local place plans are kind of a way to try and fill that gap. But then the tension remains because we've removed that intermediate piece. So you get this tension between participatory democracy and representative democracy that almost end up clashing. But we really need both, and we've lost the connecting point. And I think that's where we're getting some of the conflict of scale and power. And I can only think that the only way to resolve that might be to go back to what we've lost. And in England, actually, with parish councils, they still have a bit more of that local level power that we've lost through the readjustment that we had. I'll stop there.
Jonathan.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a great discussion, and I should have said at the beginning, thanks, Nick. It's a great presentation, a fascinating kind of topic. Where I would strengthen, I guess, what's just been said, is that I would say that we need more deliberative democracy. This can be a win-win, but it goes back to the fundamentals, in my opinion and experience, of what a plan is and what it does. And the strength of a plan is in the process, how you reach into those different, communities, because at the moment that they're almost duplicating, but at a smaller scale, the local development plan. That's not necessarily solving a problem, because we still have issues of how do you reach in to gain the voices that are hard to hear, for example, younger people. And at the moment, that opportunity for creating the conditions that make it more likely than not to give the voice to the people that are often not heard still don't always appear to be being made through that process. So the risk is we've just taken a local development plan for a local development scale area and condensed that to a smaller place. And I don't know if that's actually helping to solve the problem. And I suspect it's risking this polarization between, participatory democracy and representative democracy, and I think the answer to that might be in deliberative democracy at a local scale. But these plans do need to set out the context, and I think that our language might need to change from top down versus bottom up, which is almost certainly classical and out of date in my opinion, in its own right. We start communities in the centre and set that in context to the global scale. So there's something for sure in my experience around being able to be clear and co-learning with people. So yes, have a view, have an aspiration, but see that in the wider context, because that context's a democratic context. And I think there's a big risk here that we fuel tribalism and division, and that's almost happening already from my limited or our limited experience of place plans, which are emerging at the moment. I'll hold at that.
And I think you've put your fingers on something which Paul hinted at earlier on as well. So, and that's the kind of the potential role of somebody external is to help bring in those wider viewpoints. And it's not that it doesn't need to be a planner. It could be a facilitator who encourages them to be drawn out of the community. But there's something around bringing in climate change or those wider thoughts or the evidence base. I think that's a really important bit of producing a local place plan, which I didn't touch on in the presentation. But I think if you're organising a community event, for example, you're going into a school, I think it's kind of incumbent on the facilitator person to remind people of the absolute basics. Is that so if there's a dropping population, explaining that to people, but in quite simple terms. That's just one example. So yes, I completely agree. Yeah.
I mean, I'm at risk of hogging the call as well, but I mean, there are other opportunities as well. At the moment, the spatial definitions need to be clear. We have no definition of what place is really. It can't be all things to all people, because practically, if you look to delivery, we need to work on exactly and practically set that out. So, for example, neighbourhood, which is arguably a subdivision of city or settlement, isn't necessarily specified currently in National Planning Framework 4, and that's not helpful. If you can set that out in terms of pragmatics and putting health at the core for that, then you have a much better quality of conversation, because people have got a much greater understanding as to what that means and why. So there's an awful lot that we all need to do, and that spans, in my opinion and experience, both consultants, the public sector, and others, communities out there at large. So I come back to the quality of the process in that case, the quality of the communication, and I think the level of complexity is significantly high. So the one magic ingredient is certainly that I'd advocate for is a large level of humility, and that's not always been the case with either local authorities, some local representatives in inverted commas, because they're not always representative. The only people who can claim to be representative are those that have actually gone out to a ballot. So local community councils are arguably are nearest the grassroots level of democracy, but they don't have to have a ballot, and that's currently part of the rules unless they've changed in the last 12 to 18 months. So there's definitely work to be done there in terms of the wider system, but I think it's a systemic approach that would significantly help to strengthen democracy if democracy still matters, and for me that does. I'm on a soapbox now, so I'll shut up.
Thanks,
Sarah,
John.
very aware of time. You probably want to bring us to order.
Yeah, no, I am. And I thought Jonathan did a fantastic job of rounding us off almost with Democracy Matters. No, in Democracy Matters, that was a really good point to bring the conversation to a close. I'd like to thank Nick for a fantastic and really insightful presentation. So thanks very much, Nick. Please do all join me in saying thank you. And the round of applause is appearing on screen now, Nick.
Thank you.
And yes, thank you all very much for joining today as well and for sharing your views. It was a really interesting conversation from everybody, some really, really good insights overall. And yeah, just thanks very much for your time. This session has been recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in due course, and I will share details of that when that is done. So again, thanks very much to everybody and have a nice afternoon.